So with 44, Michael, we go into the how does it all affect me and you and everybody who's listening, and you call this dessert. But so as we look at 44, you talk about, if we're going to have an environment, you make the point that the environment for the hominin populations of the last millions of years is the environment that really has shaped us enormously.
Well, the interesting thing about 44 is sort of the preface to a series of points about, preferred lifestyles. The point about 44 is to, in part, answer a riddle, which is, why do we live so long? And the reason why we live so long is we have adopted a way of life. We have found ourselves in what ecologists call a niche, in which we're pretty hard to kill, and it's pretty hard for us to starve to death. Predators going up against us pretty much any time in the last 500 to 800,000 years would normally have been confronting an armed band that is very good at using weapons, that cooperates effectively. So long as you're part of that armed band, you are relatively invulnerable with respect to what the predators in your environment can do. And you can go out and hunt and kill and cook and otherwise process a whole bunch of things, both animal and plant, from which you can extract nutrition. So after, 1 or 2 billion years of the evolution of life came up with this organism that's really amazingly indomitable. We're pretty hard to take down. And because of that, we live a long time. Because in our evolutionary history, for the last million years, we've been able to kill most everything that threatened us almost all the time, and kill and eat most anything around us.
Yes.
And digest it relatively effectively because we could cook it, and thereby release a lot of the nutrients in those prey or those plants. So that's why we live so long. And it is that setting in which we have to fundamentally decide what we're going to do with our evolutionary history in terms of determining how best to lead our lives from a standpoint of our medical futures.
And that raises a point for me that in that kind of society, having decrepit middle-aged people who couldn't do any of those things wouldn't have been tolerated, and therefore would have been unlikely.
Yeah, I think that, when anthropologists look at hunter-gatherer populations, especially ones that have not been marginalized by agricultural civilizations, they're quite surprised by what they find. The historical records of what the native populations of Virginia were like when the Elizabethan settlers first got there. Those records are remarkable because what they show are people who stood taller than the English settlers were, who looked amazing compared to these scruffy, scrawny, just creepy-looking Europeans. That was a reality. There's a lot in some of the great myths of what Native Americans were like before they got our diseases, before they started eating our foods, where they were in amazing condition. And they stayed amazing for very long periods of time.
Does that also then set up a positive cycle, Michael, where we can have a more neotenous, long childhood? Many humans don't really grow up till their early 20s, and that suggests to me that they learn, they get more culture kind of banged into them and become smarter and more able to do all these things. But the success of the tribe in providing food and defense and shelter allows this very extended childhood, which allows more learning, which allows everything, the whole wheel to turn in a more positive way. Am I being too optimistic in this, or do you think there's something to be said for that?
I think the view you just articulated would be pretty much a consensus view as to how our evolution worked. We became really smart, and because we became really smart, which in turn requires a larger brain, we became better at dealing with a newborn child, which is really much more like a fetus in many other mammalian species. We're not really, in any meaningful sense, good to go until we're on the order of 8 to 10 years old.
Yeah.
Until that point in time, the human child is remarkably hapless and helpless.